Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you enjoyed your lunch and enjoyed taking a walk around the department and sharing memories with each other. I welcome you back for our afternoon panels, and I'd like to introduce the moderator of our next panel, Kathy Thielen, who is Ford Professor of Political Science, the author of several award-winning books, whose work focuses on the origins and evolution of political economic institutions in rich democracies. Welcome, Kathy.
Okay, so our first panel this afternoon is Conducting Research at MIT. What is unique about being a political scientist here? And our faculty panelists were asked to reflect on the singular work that they do here at the Institute. So our speakers are Stephen Van Evera, who is the Ford International Professor and who studies the causes and prevention of war, U.S. foreign policy, and U.S. security policy, among many other topics. Chapel Lawson, who's Associate Professor of Political Science, the current head of MISTI, which is the MIT International Science and Technology Initiatives and International Policy Lab, and is a former Executive Director of Planning and Policy at U.S. Customs and Border Control. Lily Tsai is Associate Professor of Political Science. She studies governance in the developing countries of Asia and East Africa and is the founder of MIT GovLab. Christopher Warshaw is Assistant Professor of Political Science. He studies political representation as well as judicial politics and energy policy, and he's going to be discussing big data and public policy. Kenneth Oy is Director of the MIT Program on Emerging Technologies, and he's a member of the MIT Synthetic Biology Center and MIT Center for Biomedical Innovation. He studies and teaches international relations, political economy, and technology policy, and he's going to discuss science and technology policy. And Nazli Shukri is Professor of Political Science and Principal Investigator of a multi-year project in explorations in cyber international relations. And she will be speaking on issues of cyber security. And so we will begin with Steve Van Evera.
Thanks, Kathy. So I took my instruction to talk about what's it like to do research at MIT, and I decided I would talk about what's it like to do research if you're a graduate student here. What's the nature of culture among the grad students and the graduate student experience here, which of course I'm not a graduate student, but I hang with them, and I hear what they have to say, and I think one of the most terrific things about our department is the way we conduct graduate training, and I want to say a few words about my perception of what is the sort of core signature or essence of our graduate training theory and philosophy and the way it all works here, and then talk a little bit about the products that we produced, of which I think we ought to be very proud. I'm very proud of the products we produced, especially the PhD dissertations and books that our alums have produced. So first let me just say a few words about the culture that exists amongst graduate students who are in the program and at MIT. There's a very striking, I think, culture of collaboration and mutual teaching that is part of the signature of MIT and distinctive from other schools, in which the students engage in a large amount of, if you will, mutual teaching and mutual help while they're here. Lots of special and extra seminars that the students organize for themselves on special topics and co-teaching, co-studying. And I will share a secret with you, which is the faculty actually encourage this. This is something that doesn't happen by accident. One of our theories is that half the things you learn in grad school you learn from each other, and that one has to work to break down, if you will, the fear factor that students have when they show up, being that everyone thinks they're the only dumb one in the room, and that they're the only one with the dumb question that they're afraid to ask, and it takes a while to create a sense of community that enables people to ask what they think is the dumb question, which of course it rarely is. And so this mutual teaching culture, I think, is a signature of MIT and a very important one. Second is a toleration of difference. I think I'm very proud myself that even though we focus on policy and subjects about which people have a great deal of passion and concern, there's a culture of toleration and pluralism that any seriously put view is to be respected, and no seriously put views to be off the table. We have left-wing students and right-wing students and all kinds of other color students who come through our program. I think students who find no faculty who particularly agree with them on things, but nevertheless know that if they're acting like scientists and trying to be serious, there's no litmus test for the policies you recommend or the implications of your work, which is, I think, it's a hard climate to create, especially when you're dealing with materials or subjects or topics that have a lot high stakes topics on which passions run high. I also think there's no culture here of cloning of faculty hoping students will agree with them. I've had several grad students who made crystal clear how full of it they thought I was, and I took a certain, after I had some indigestion and the Malox and all that, I took pleasure in knowing that I was at a school where the culture was such that the students knew that we were in the business of raising up students to be great scholars in their own right, and you don't achieve that if you indicate that you are hoping the students are in the end going to agree with the great learned faculty who are now in charge of the program, but rather the whole name of the game is to encourage students to think their own ideas even when they're at sharp odds with the faculty. And the last sort of cultural thing I'll simply say is sort of an ethical culture, a sense that there's a duty to, if you will, be paying back to the wider society for the wider society's support for all of us here, as expressed in the topics and subjects that our students have written about, which so often I think have to do with big problems of the wider world, the notion being that that's what should concern us. We have an implied social contract with the wider world, that we should be addressing the worries of the wider world, and that culture seeps through, I think, very clearly into the graduate training program and is expressed in the theses that we see our students write. And I would say there's three distinctive things or signatures of PhD dissertations that come out of the department, and I'm thinking here of sort of my sampling is the last 20, 25 years. You've already heard some about some of our terrific students. Vip Narang was summarizing the work now being done by the new cohort of students who are working on nuclear problems. So I'll talk about other theses, but it was sort of hard for me to narrow down a list of dissertations that deserve special mention. And so I'll probably cut the list short, and apologies for anyone I leave out. But to me, there are sort of three signatures of these. One is that, as Ben Valentino was talking about the culture among the faculty, the culture among the students is also to ask big questions. Don't choose topics because you have a method that will address them, and don't choose topics with safety in mind. Don't focus first and foremost on the doable project. Focus on the question which, if answered well, will have the most benefit to the world. And that means usually, quote, big questions. Second is questions that are relevant to the real world, where you can, without passing the giggle test, you can imagine how this work will help solve a problem that worries those outside academia. And third is, I think there's a multidisciplinary signature to our work here, a culture that the best work is often done by combining knowledge from different disciplines. Many of the dissertations I've been involved in were by students who drew heavily from other fields or disciplines in doing their work. The first dissertation I was going to mention, Heather Gregg wrote a dissertation on when do religions become dangerous? When do religious communities become aggressive for reasons based on their faith and turn to violence? And she had a background in theology, and she drew very heavily on her knowledge in theology to write a dissertation, an important thesis on, if you will, when does religion become a cause of war or conflict? And the underlying importance of it is to help explain this turn toward violence and aggression that we've seen in the last 25 years in religious communities worldwide. Other dissertations that sort of I would offer as examples, and work, not just theses, of having these signatures. Kelly Greenhill's thesis has already been mentioned on how bad actor governments have used refugees as political weapons, Castro in particular, but there are others who have used the expulsion of refugees as a weapon against those they a weapon of coercion against states they're having conflict with. She's also writing a new book on why or how non-fact-based ideas, shall we say falsehoods, become widely believed in society, which is sort of an urgent question as we become more and more worried that our own national discourse is infected with ungrounded beliefs. Alan Cooperman wrote a very important thesis. Barry was mentioning what he learned from it about the moral hazard problem that arises when the U.S. supports or gives rhetorical support to human rights abroad without bounding it carefully and making sure that everyone understands that the support is highly conditional on good conduct by those the U.S. would support, and how in the past it has more than once led, if you will, the good guys, people who are under the hammer or suffering in some way, to do things to provoke U.S. intervention and actually make conflicts worse. Kosovo is an example of that. And there are others, and sometimes it's led to even much greater violence than was happening at the time when the U.S. first spoke about the need to protect human rights. Jenny Lind wrote an important thesis on what she jokingly calls apologiology, the whole question of how important is it that parties to a conflict admit the wrongs they have done and apologize for them as a means of reconciliation. Is this an important, if you will, conflict terminating technique? Yinan He also wrote an important book on a closely related subject. It's a general piece of work on how do enduring conflicts in the end get resolved? How can they be steered toward resolution? One of the key components of it being what's the role of historical narratives in all of this? And if you commonize the historical narratives, can you bring parties who have been in enduring conflict towards some kind of reconciliation? She looks at the case of Japan and China, and then she also looks at the case of Germany and Poland. It's a very important, if you will, study on conflict termination. Sarah Lischer wrote an important thesis on when and how and why refugee crises spread into wider war. How do they become civil wars, and then how do civil wars become international wars? And when she wrote it, this was before the latest huge expansion of refugee populations worldwide, but it's highly germane to the implications of letting the current refugee crisis in Africa, run without stemming. And her book is really a warning that this isn't just a humanitarian disaster. This lays the seeds of war, and her book outlines sort of what the mechanisms would be on how a refugee crisis can feed a war and trigger it and feed it. My own fear is we're going to see much more, if you will, refugee movement and population transfer down the road. And you're waving your hand at me. I've talked too long. And I was just getting going. I got a big fat list. But yay for our side. Aren't we great? That's the theme here today. So I'll stop with that.